Now, welcome to part 14 of 15 of my story that will, in a way, both carry on the Star Wars sequel trilogy or continue the journey of some of its characters, while also sort of rewriting or undoing the story of the sequels at the same time. Or, as I like to put it, this is a story of how what comes next will change what came before. And if you're new to the story, or if you haven't seen the first several parts yet, I would highly recommend starting with part 1, or if you need to catch up, then catch up, and then working your way back to this one. Otherwise, what is going on right now in the story will make no sense to you whatsoever, and a link to the playlist can be found in the description below. And so now, without further ado, let's get back to the story. We begin by watching Luke's X-Wing descend through the atmosphere of a green and blue world, one that Grogu, who sits on his lap, has just said in Luke's mind was his home. And as the surface of the lush green world comes into view, though it's obscured somewhat by a thin gray mist, Luke says to Grogu, who only stares wide-eyed out the window, "Where exactly should I, land?" Grogu then turns his head and looks at Luke with something like a smile on his face, and Luke responds, "Right, I should let the Force guide me, and here I'm probably supposed to be the one teaching you that." Grogu makes a noise as if he finds humor in that, and Luke then takes in a deep breath and lets it out slowly before shutting his eyes and taking a tighter grip on the X-Wing's controls. A short time later, we watch as Luke opens his eyes just as the X-Wing sets down in a small, swampy clearing surrounded by tall, twisting ancient trees, and where a light rain is falling. Luke again looks at Grogu as if seeking some sort of confirmation about this being the right spot, but the child seems too focused on the world beyond to even notice or respond. Luke then glances over his shoulder and says, "Any signs of civilization, R2?" But the droid's domed head swivels from side to side, and he gives a negative-sounding whistle. Luke makes a bit of a frown and grumbles that, of course, it wouldn't be that simple, as he hits a button and the canopy on the X-Wing begins to open. Moments later, he hops out of the ship and onto the soft, squishy, almost sponge-like ground at his feet that is covered in short grass. He looks around for a moment but is quickly distracted by Grogu, who is waving his arms at him as if all but demanding some help getting down. Luke then obliges the child and sets him down on the ground before looking around once more and commenting to himself that the Force is almost overwhelming here. Even Dagobah didn't feel anything like this. He then glances down and sees that the child is already slowly moving off in a particular direction. Luke then says, "That way, huh?" And the child briefly turns to give him an affirmative look before turning and heading on. Very slowly, of course. That's when Luke says, "I've got a better idea," and scoops Grogu up before continuing, "You point, I'll walk." After a moment of contemplation, the child seems to find that acceptable and points off in the direction he was already heading. Luke then looks back at R2 and tells him to stay with the ship, which gets a response that seems to be R2's way of saying, "I always get stuck with the ship," before Luke heads off and walks towards the tall trees, and then into them. That's when we're taken to somewhere in hyperspace, where we see a Star Destroyer traveling through a swirling blue tunnel. Next, we're taken to a detention cell on that ship, one with a few small trees in it which the Salamari creatures are attached to, preventing Ezra Bridger, who is chained to the wall of the cell, from using the Force. Soon enough, the door to the cell slides open, and in strides Thrawn, hands folded behind his back. As soon as Ezra sees him, he lets out a small, snorting laugh and says, "Oh look, Palpatine let his lackey come to see me." To that, Thrawn makes a face that's half annoyed and half curious as to what exactly Ezra is getting at or implying. Ezra, seeing that face, then continues, "I'm guessing you didn't get permission to come speak to me, because there's no way Palpatine would ever want you to hear the truth from me, to put doubt in that mind of yours." Thrawn arches an eyebrow and asks, "And what truth would that be?" Ezra replies that the only reason he wants to attack Lothal is to convince me to let him into the world between worlds, that place you fear so much. Thrawn makes no sort of reply, and his face betrays nothing of his thoughts, and so Ezra continues, "Come on, I know this can't be your idea, attacking Lothal for no good reason, a world with no strategic value whatsoever to whatever might be left of the Empire. Certainly you wouldn't be so petty as to return to the site of a defeat and seek vengeance. Not the Thrawn I got to know anyway. Not the one who I learned wasn't evil after all, who was actually a lot like me, and whose top concern was always his people." Thrawn then gives a slight smile as if impressed and says, Worthy attempt to appeal to my better nature, young Bridger. But those people of mine that you spoke of cannot afford me to be indecisive in this moment. Palpatine is the best chance for this part of the galaxy to unite under one banner, and to then help the Chiss Ascendancy and the others out there who will stand and fight to oppose what's coming. This threat from beyond our galaxy that I'm sure he must have told you about. Ezra begins to nod his head a bit and says, yeah, he told me all about that. Wasted his time trying to convince me helping him would be my best course of action. But did he tell you about what he's become, the power he's attained, that he's basically the culmination of all the Sith that have come before, that he'll gladly destroy the entire galaxy before seeing it no freedom from him? When Thrawn says nothing, Ezra smiles a bit and then continues. Of course you know and realize all this. You're always one step ahead of everyone, even him. And of course he told you not to talk to me, which is exactly why you're here, isn't it? Just to confirm everything you already know. A flicker of a smile and a look of something like respect or appreciation crosses Thrawn's face before replying, under different circumstances, I think you and I could have become comrades. To that, Ezra shakes his head a bit and says, and to think, once upon a time, I actually thought we were. I thought we were friends. Those words almost, just almost, seem to sting Thrawn, and so Ezra continues. You know what I don't understand about all of this? It's the why. Why are you helping Palpatine if you know all this about him? If you know he's just as likely to ultimately destroy the galaxy than he is to save it? You're back in the wrong faith here. Thrawn quickly replies. A bad option is always better than no option at all. But to that, Ezra shakes his head and says, there's the New Republic, right? Thrawn then scoffs, you've been gone too long, young Bridger. The New Republic is little more than a bunch of rebels playing make-believe, pretending they know how to create a strong and stable government for all, but already they fight amongst themselves, fight over how much power a centralized governing body should have over the individual systems, how much responsibility they should bear should a world, especially one that offers little in return, should such a world face a crisis of some kind or even come under attack. Thrawn takes a few bold steps towards Ezra, and with a slight edge of anger in his eyes, he continues. Attacking Lothal, an unimportant, non-strategic target, as you call it, is not a petty attempt at vengeance, but a way to quickly and decisively break the already failing resolve of a government that will so quickly shy away from another conflict that they will soon find themselves once more under the heel of the Empire. And when the time comes, when this threat from the unknown arrives, they will all have a choice to fight or be fodder. Either way, they will serve their empire and be of use to it. Without another word, then, Thrawn immediately turns and heads out of the cell. Next, we're taken to another ship in hyperspace, where this time, in the cockpit, we see Ahsoka Tano and Sabine Wren seated side by side, both with looks of grim determination on their face. It's Sabine who then says, after reading a message they've just received, the Lothal security force says they're as prepared as they're ever going to be, but there's no way they're going to hold out long against a fleet of Star Destroyers. Sabine lets out a sigh before finishing. I sure hope whatever help Leia can get will be enough. Ahsoka then says, it will be. It has to be. Sabine quickly responds, and what if it's not? Ahsoka is quiet for a long moment before turning towards Sabine and saying, then we do all we can to save Ezra first, and then we help the people of Lothal as much as we possibly can. Sabine gives a faint nod of the head, as if that's what she wants the plan to be, but there's a bit of doubt about whether that's what the plan should be. When Ahsoka notices it, she says to Sabine, we're not just saving Ezra for personal reasons, we're saving him because of all the good he can yet do. His part to play in all of this is far from over. Sabine nods her head, again like she wants to agree, but still looks somewhat unconvinced as she says, but is one life worth countless others, even if they can do all this good? And even if you care for that one life more than anyone else out there, can we really justify saving Ezra and possibly forsaking so many others, even if I care about him so much? Sabine then shakes her head a bit after saying that, maybe because she can't believe she said it out loud, or maybe because she never realized just how much she cared about Ezra until right now. She then continues, if given the choice, Ezra wouldn't hesitate to lay down his life for his people, for Lothal, for even just one of them. Coming after him isn't what he'd want us to do. Ahsoka again turns and looks at Sabine and says, then what do you think we should do? Because I honestly don't know how much the two of us can sway the outcome of this battle anyway. But I do believe we can save Ezra. After a few moments, Sabine nods in agreement, but then she says to herself, and when we do save him, I sure hope he'll forgive me for it. And now we're taken to yet another ship in hyperspace, this time to a small freighter where in the cargo hold, looking in deep thought and seated on a container, is Finn. Without him even noticing, or at least reacting, Mara Jade takes a seat next to him on the container and lays a hand on his shoulder before saying, I feel it too. Finn gives her a look as if to ask what exactly she's talking about, and Mara replies, Palpatine, he's going to be there, overseeing the attack on Lothal, which means your friend, Rey, will be there too. But Finn shakes his head and replies, she's gone, I can feel it somehow, or should I say, I can feel her absence somehow, that she's not out there anywhere anymore. But to that Mara shakes her head and says, no one's ever really gone. That's not how it works. If Palpatine is using her body, then Rey must still be there somewhere, locked away, which means she can still be saved. At first, Finn gives her a look as if he doesn't recognize her, as if this isn't the same person he met several weeks back now, that she's changed. But then, after realizing what she said, there's this brief flicker of hope on his face, one that quickly fizzles away as he says, but how do we get Palpatine out? And shouldn't we just be focused on stopping Palpatine, on destroying him, even if it means Rey's life? Mara is about to respond to that, but suddenly Finn seems to become distracted and as if his mind just went somewhere else to something he heard in the past. He then repeats those words he remembers. That's how we're gonna win. Not fighting what we hate but saving what we love. Finn chuckles and shakes his head a little bit as in disbelief. He then continues, it didn't make all too much sense to me then. I thought she was delirious maybe, but it makes sense now. Mara asks what he's talking about, but that's when Poe, coming from the cockpit, enters the cargo hold and immediately says, no further word from Leia, but I know she won't fail. She'll get help to Lothal one way or another. Finn then says, and what exactly do we do until help arrives? It's Mara who quickly answers, you said it yourself a moment ago. We focus on what we care about, what you care about. We try to save Rey. Immediately, Poe starts to shake his head and says, yeah, I don't know if that's such a good idea. For me, anyway. She was in my head a long time ago. But part of her is still in there, I think. Or maybe I should say a part of Palpatine is still in there. I'm keeping my distance. Sorry, buddy. While Finn nods his head in understanding, Mara quickly says back to Poe, he was in my head for a long time too, but you don't see me afraid. Poe gives a slight shrug and says, well, maybe you should be afraid. Before Mara can snap back at him, Finn says, maybe he's right. Maybe it's not a good idea for you to get anywhere near Palpatine. But to that, Mara steadfastly shakes her head and says, I do not fear him. Besides, I'm not so sure it's a good idea for you to face him alone. In fact, it's not a good idea at all. All three fall silent for a while before Finn breaks that silence by asking Poe, don't suppose there was any word from Luke? Poe shakes his head and says, nope, nothing I'm afraid. Finn glances at Mara to see her reaction to that, and when she notices him looking for a reaction, she only frowns at him and says, I told you before, I have no doubt that Luke will be there, that he'll show up right when we need him most likely. At least I sure hope so. That's when we're taken back to a swampy green world where we see Luke still carrying Grogu, trudging through dense, tall trees and across soft, spongy ground. We then hear him grumble, I sure hope you know where we're going. Grogu then looks up at him as if again saying something in Luke's mind, and then Luke replies, you said we were really close a while ago. I'm starting to wonder why you had me land so far away. Moments after saying that, the swamp opens into a small clearing where there are some dozen or so small, crude huts made mostly of mud and sticks, and ones that don't look all too different from Yoda's hut on Dagobah. From a few of them, a thin trail of smoke rises up out of a chimney as if a small fire or cooking fire burns within. After a few moments, out from one of these huts and carrying a wooden bowl full of soup perhaps, emerges a very elderly-looking small green being with large ears and wearing clothing that could easily pass for old rags. When Grogu spots the being, who is clearly of his species, he immediately starts squirming as if he wants to be put down, and so Luke does just that. He sets Grogu down, and the little guy, as fast as his stubby little legs will take him, begins to head towards the other being. And when the being spots him, out of stunned surprise, he drops the bowl of whatever he was carrying, and calls out something in a very strange language that almost sounds, for lack of a better way of putting it, rather frog-like. The ancient being then, even slower than Grogu it seems, begins to slowly shuffle his way towards the child, just as a couple more such beings, some male, some female, all looking ancient, emerge from other huts and get excited to see the child. Soon they're all gathered around him, speaking excitedly in this strange language, and even Grogu seems to speak this language. All the while then, Luke stands there awkwardly as if not sure if he should announce himself some way somehow or just keep standing there. Finally though, one of the other beings, the one that first came out, looks to Luke and starts making his way towards him. When he's but a few paces away, the being says, "The Skywalker you are." Luke, slightly confused by the question, shakes his head a bit and says, "I am Luke Skywalker, if that's what you're asking." The Yoda-like creature seems a bit confused himself and then says, "The one created by the Force you are." But Luke says, No, that was my father. He was the one created by the Force, supposedly." He then thinks for a moment and asks, "How did you know about that anyway, about the prophecy of the Chosen One?" The being responds, "Told we were of him, by one of our kind, by Yoda." Luke smiles a bit and says, "He was my master for a while, and I see you talk just like him." The being, not looking offended or anything like it, replies, "Strange your language is to us, impossible to master." Luke then takes a moment to listen to the other Yoda-like creatures who are still gathered around Grogu, to listen to their very odd, again, frog-like language. He then nods as if he can understand why basic could perhaps be rather difficult for them. He then asks, "What exactly is this place?" The being responds, "Final home this is of our people." Luke then echoes, "Final home? Are there no more of your kind here on the planet? Or maybe out there in the stars somewhere?" The being responds, "Like your father, created by the Force, our kind once was, a long, long, long time ago. The very first we were, and back then many of us there were, helping life in a young galaxy grow and flourish. Our gift and curse this was." Luke, not understanding, repeats him, "Your curse?" The being gives a slow single nod of the head. "To help, to use what you call the Force, we must give of ourself. And to create more of our kind," at this point the being slowly turns and looks at Grogu, "we must also give of ourself. And though the Force is infinite, our time and power with it is not. Run out it has, or will one day with Grogu's end." Luke, still looking a little confused, gives a vague nod of the head and says, I think I understand." Luke then turns and looks at Grogu, still surrounded by the others, who all look as old, if not older, than Yoda did at his end. Luke then says, "It took everything you all had left to create him, didn't it?" The being nods a bit and says, "Knew Yoda did, that fall the Jedi Order might. Knew he did, that one of our kind might be needed to help rebuild it." Luke then shakes his head almost wistfully and says, "And here I thought I'd be training him." The being then lets out a small chuckle, sounding so much like Yoda for just a moment that we see a look of fond yet painful remembrance cross Luke's face. The being then says, "Your help and training he will still need, as his you will need. Help each other you will. Guide the Skywalkers he will, until he is no more, and they are all that remain." Luke's brow wrinkles in confusion, and he says, "Skywalkers all that remain? How would I ever outlive him?" To that all the being says is, "Pass on what you have learned to other Skywalkers." Luke, looking stunned, manages to say, Yoda, that's what he said to me right before he... The being nods as if he knows that, and then says, "And have you?" Luke, almost shamefully, shakes his head and says, "My sister, I started to train her, but she chose another path." The being then shakes his head and says, "Her Yoda was not speaking of. Your nephew, he meant. And your son." Luke's mouth falls open, but he doesn't seem to be able to ask any of the numerous questions that are suddenly on the tip of his tongue. The being then only nods his head as if to answer all of them at once. Luke then looks and sees that Grogu is slowly making his way over to them now, a look that is somehow both happy and sad upon the child's face, while the ancient beings he leaves behind have similar looks. The being who's been with Luke then speaks again, looking at Grogu as he does. "Help our kind once did, oh so long ago, create the first Jedi Order, and guide it for many generations it did. And so now help it will to build a new one. And fear not, others not of our kind, you will soon meet, who will help as well." The being then turns and looks at Luke and continues, "But what that new order will become is up to you to decide, and already know you do what that is." We then see Luke's mind flash back to the temple on the frozen world, where he encountered a strange future vision of his nephew Ben, who had fallen to the dark side, and who had told him that, in the future, he had or would abandon him, that he would be responsible for his fall to the dark side because he left him behind. Then, through the Force, another image comes to his mind, a memory that is not his own, but one he seems to understand nonetheless. It is one of a young and desperate-looking Anakin Skywalker, Luke's father, kneeling before Palpatine and begging him to help him save Padme, that he can't live without her, and then promising to do whatever his new master asks of him. Suddenly then, that image seems to merge with one of him, an older version of Luke, tossing a lightsaber over his shoulder, his father's lightsaber, and walking away from future Ben Solo. Then both images fade from his mind, and he's brought back to the present, where we see him begin to nod his head, complete and utter resolve upon his face now. He then says, "I understand. Letting go of our attachments can be just as dangerous as holding on too tightly. Like with all things, there must be balance between the two, and that shall be the way of the new Jedi Order." Next, we're taken to hyperspace once again, where we're on the bridge of an Imperial Star Destroyer where Rey Palpatine stands next to Thrawn, both looking out into the blue, swirling void beyond. And then suddenly the ship drops out of hyperspace, and the two are looking upon the world of Lothal. That's when Thrawn says, "Jam all outgoing communications from the planet and tell the fleet to move into low orbital position for optimal bombardment." We're then momentarily taken outside of the ship and see that, in total, 8 Star Destroyers have come out of hyperspace and are quickly moving towards the planet and getting very close to it, in some sort of attack formation that has the tip of their wedge-shaped ships pointed directly down at the planet below. Back on the bridge then, Thrawn says, "When all ships are in position, begin bombardment and have ground forces standing by for invasion of the capital city and all other major cities." However, before any Star Destroyer can even fire, an officer yells out, "Admiral, Lothal Defense Forces in formation and now approaching fast from planet's surface." Hearing that seems to momentarily surprise or even confuse Thrawn. After thinking for just a moment or two, he says, "Tell the fleet to pull back from Lothal and assume defense formation Zeta 2. Rey Palpatine then turns and glares at Thrawn, clearly upset and demanding to know what he's doing. Thrawn explains, "At best, Lothal's defense force should have taken at least 8 minutes to fully prepare and mobilize. The fact that it took them less than 4 tells us that they knew we were coming, and they were prepared ahead of time, which means the New Republic also knows we're coming, and could be on the way." Rey Palpatine then says, "Continue the bombardment anyway. Let the New Republic come if they dare." Thrawn then says, "My lord, this is a very vulnerable formation. If even a remotely sizable and competently commanded fleet arrives with us in low orbit, they could have half our fleet destroyed before we could even hope to mount a counter-offensive." Rey Palpatine snaps back, You said it yourself, Grand Admiral. The New Republic is too much in disarray and too busy bickering amongst itself to care about Lothal, and this attack will cause their already fragile government to crumble as the individual worlds realize they're really on their own, just like Lothal is here. Thrawn nods his head as if concurring he said that, but there's still a look of doubt or hesitation on his face, as everyone on the bridge is looking at and waiting for him to give the order to either fire as Rey Palpatine has commanded, or to fall back as he originally commanded, and take on a new formation in case of a New Republic attack. Finally, Thrawn speaks up and gives his order. And that is where this part ends. Well, that's all I've got for you this time. Now it's your turn to tell me what you thought of this part, and how you think this all ends in next week's finale, which should be up on Tuesday or Wednesday. Whatever you think, leave a comment below and let's talk some Star Wars. And until next time, thanks for watching.